Hi, this is Angelo John Lewis for the Diversity and Spirituality Network podcast. And in case you're not familiar with us, we're a group of people that actively practice the integration of diversity and spirituality. If you'd like to know more about us, please visit our website, diversityandspirituality.com. Today, we're going to talk about a very unexplored topic, which is the role of religion and society. And I've got two esteemed guests that I want to introduce you to. The first is Coreene Archer, who's a principal leadership development coach and internal communications consultant at the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. Coreene has directed the Institute's flagship Leicester Conference and the A.K. Rice Institute's annual conference in the U.S. She's a co-director of the Institute's Coaching for Leadership Development course. And relative to our communication, or relative to our topic, she's previously worked in the faith community, and as such has deep knowledge of the challenges that faces that sector. Mark Argent wears a lot of hats, including being a spiritual director, an elder in the United Reformed Church, and an activist with deep involvement with the liberal democratic politics in the UK. As he says on his website, he cut his teeth politically in the United Reformed Church's involvement with church and society, and was very involved in the ecumenical and multi-faith engagement with the regional governments in east of England during the Labour government's experiments with devolution in the English regions, which of course means nothing to the United States people, which includes serving as the secretary of East England's church network and the East of England's Faith Council. Coreene and Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, since we're talking about religion and society, I think it's fair to have you tell me a little bit about your own religious backgrounds. And Mark, I know it's kind of a long story, so we have about 50 minutes, so please keep it relatively short if you can. Coreene, you can go start. It's an alphabetical order here.
Okay. Okay, so my background is not a complex one. I grew up in the church. My parents were Methodists, so I went to Methodist church with them. And I always believed that there was more than me. And I think that my personal commitment to faith happened when I was probably in my 20s. I think the thing about growing up in church is it's easy to have inherited faith, so it's not a faith that belongs to you. And it's when you start to realize that it means something more than what your parents say and just a way of being, that it sort of changes. And as part of that, I worked in the faith sector for about 10 years, with different organisations and church organisations, and just really engaged with what it means to be a Christian, and to try to live that way in the world that we live in now. But it's a challenge because for me, I felt that church was really out of step with the real world, and although faith is I still think real and relevant and valid, it's not experienced as such. And for more and more people, it's not foundational. So you seem like there's something, rather than it being a core value, it makes you're seen as being a bit strange in the wider society. And I think that I don't know if I think this is probably a common story, that people who work in the faith sector often get burnt by the faith sector, and after that amount of time of working with churches and Christians and believing or expecting a different kind of behaviour from them, I found I just stepped away. It was just too many difficulties and too many other issues that weren't addressed and were masked over by faith behaviour. So I stepped away, and but when something's foundational, it never really leaves you. So I've always ended up being drawn towards things about spirituality and working in the faith sector, or working with faith, things that are faith elements, have faith to it. So here we are now.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's like, you're in a faith organization, so everybody is a big believer. That doesn't mean that everything works well in the organization. It has nothing to do with it.
No, no.
In fact, it can be the opposite kind of thing.
Absolutely. I think I've experienced some of the worst behaviour amongst people working in the faith sector. Just, it's just unbelievable stuff. So, yeah, it's good to yeah, I think that the problem is our expectations of them are so much higher that we think they're going to live their life to a different standard. But, regardless of the sector that you're in, managers are managers, and sometimes they don't know how to manage and don't know how to treat people. So, it becomes difficult.
So, Mark, please introduce yourself to us in terms of your religious background.
Absolutely. I grew up in the United Reformed Church, which in US terms means Presbyterian. Actually, the union lives two churches, but I'm on the Presbyterian end of that. Got involved in Ignatian spirituality, which is a bit of the Catholic world, and I've done quite a lot of retreat centre work, sort of giving retreats and one-to-one and group spiritual direction. Get kind of involved in the group relations world because there's a fairly natural linkage between those two. Certainly if you're coming out of a tradition that thinks in terms of God encountered in the process of a group rather than something else. And kind of picking up on Coreene's point, I mean, that I think one shouldn't put the religious world on too much of a pedestal because it can get nasty. And I know for me, there was one of my baptisms of fire was actually involvement in my own denomination's engagement with the gay issue, which was a very long and tortuous debate. We've ended up in a very gay-friendly position, but certainly it was a complicated journey there. And I think a very delicate task of engaging with the shock of people on the other side of the fence who suddenly discovered that the world was rather more gay-friendly than they'd expected.
Both of you are involved in this thing called Tavistock group relations, and probably a lot of people that listen to this have no idea with what that is. So one of you probably should give a brief description as to what it is.
Okay. I'll give a go. I have a go. Group relations is an experiential way of learning. So people have an opportunity to come to what we call a conference, but is really a learning event, to think about how their behaviour impacts others in a group situation. And often we are working and parts of groups. We're parts of groups in terms of our family systems and our work systems, but how we function in those systems isn't really considered or analysed. And lots of the behaviours that we have brought from home end up in organisational spaces. So it's to help people to make the connection between what has happened in the past and the markers of behaviour that they carry from their home, that family system, into their work context and other contexts, and the impact it has on others and the impact it has on themselves. Because it's learning how to take up certain roles, why you take up certain roles, why you don't take up other roles, why you're given other roles. So that's a group relations conference or event is an opportunity to really look closely at what's going on under the surface of your own mind and your behaviour when it comes to group behaviour.
One of the things I do when I attempt to explain it to other people, not being an expert, but I think one of the things that's different than the sort of the American personal growth tradition is around this understanding of group, the importance of group, and how that impacts individual behavior as opposed to the other way around, which is kind of how we in America often do it. So anyway, that's my little contribution to the subject. So I wonder, give me some sense, both of you, either of you or both of you, what is your sense? You're both religious people. I think I get that that's very important to you. How does that impact the work that you do? You're also consultants, and you're living in a world, as we both indicated in certain ways, where religion's changing a lot, and it's not even cool in many sectors to be religious.
And maybe that's a really hard one to answer, because you can't take that part of yourself out of yourself to find out what it would be like if it weren't there. So it's kind of everywhere, and maybe you live it sort of instinctively until the moment comes when you suddenly realize you're holding something that's a bit different from other people. I suppose a very brutal example would be in an organisation if it thinks its primary task is to make as much money as possible. I think somebody with a religious background might sort of raise a question mark at that and say, hang on, what do you actually mean? With the sort of, in a sense, the complicated questions of what is and isn't acceptable and what that kind of implies. And I think maybe there's also a collective bit in terms of how you think about society and social engagement. Because actually, is the world all about me as an individual, or is it about something going on in terms of a shared process? Which kind of maps onto the way religious people are often at their best held a sort of altruism that enables things to grow for. It's not narrowly the benefit of society, but there's something about God seen in other people which kind of raises everybody up.
Yeah, I guess maybe a better way to rephrase the question is that, okay, so you're people that will work and interact in secular organizations. So it really becomes a matter of how they interact with you as a religious person. That's really sort of more the issue. So maybe you could speak to that, Coreene.
I think that when I wouldn't call myself a religious person. I would call myself a woman of faith. And the way that colours my behaviour is that I think there's more than me. And I think there's more than me in everybody. So how I behave when I'm consulting is I'm working with the unconscious processes that are going on in the organisations and the different behaviours, but also thinking about what's beyond that as well, what they might be bringing in terms of their own traditions and spirituality into that space, and just trying to hold the multiple identities that most people have. But I don't think it really changes the way I behave more than trying to open up the way of engaging with people.
So you don't like see an issue if like you're working in an organization where people are sort of how can I say it? I mean, they just consider themselves secular people basically, and their values are secular.
Yeah.
Secular. Maybe they have some, they grew up in a religious background or something like that. But hello.
My daughter obviously now wants to join the conversation. Say hello.
You're supposed to be asleep. Dear. How are you?
She's supposed to be asleep. So go upstairs. I'll talk to you later. Go on. Off you go. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Go on. Oh, I kind of knew that would happen.
Well, she's
tucked up in bed, and she thought
adds an element of reality to the situation.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry about that.
It's all right. So, I mean, I guess I'll restate my question. So you go into an organization, and this organization is secular qua secular. The people don't want to hear about religion. Mm-hmm. They've got issues. I mean, what does that look like? Is that just normal for you? That's normal business? Or is there any element in there that is maybe distinct and perhaps challenging for you?
I think for me, and Mark might have a slightly different spin on this, but I think for me, where it makes a difference is that some sectors are more easy to understand. So for example, the work I do in the arts sector is easier to understand because I know that foundational is their central belief of about themselves as being an artist. And then there are other sectors that are harder to work in. So for me, working in in a sector that's purely financial is more difficult because actually the thing that's driving them is money, and that's harder to engage with. So in values organizations, you understand that there's something deeper that is motivating the behavior of the people in the system that you're working in. I don't know if you would add anything, Mark, or you've got different things.
No, in a sense, I go along with that, and I suppose the bit I pick up as well is something about what goes missing. So in the both in the financial world and the techie world, the sense is that the values bit's often not obvious, and my sense is that there's a violence being done to people precisely because that's being left at the door. So you sort of spot it by its absence rather than by its presence, which then kind of leaves the question of what's happening to somebody to make them want to function in that world or as they function in that world.
Well, I mean, to turn it around, because Coreene, and I'm building on what you said earlier, Coreene. I don't remember if it was part of the podcast or not, but also that you've worked in the faith sector, and that's a challenging sector, as you said. So speak to that a little bit. I mean, you would think everybody's got the same values, pretty much, or at least the same. They say that they espouse the same value. What are the unique challenges in that sort of environment?
I think the unique challenges is there are the ordinary pressures of work deadlines, getting things done in a timely fashion, delivering events and meeting with people in a certain way. But the reality is that certain things still have to function. So I worked, to give a bit more detail, I worked for 2 churches that were completely different. One was an Anglican church and one was a Nigerian Pentecostal church. And I worked for a Christian organisation that has a global outreach. And in working for the churches, you know, there would be times when, you know, getting things ready for a service would be more important than the people that you were serving. And I think that can happen in any sector. And in fact, I counter it a lot in my work with the health sector now, that the task becomes greater than the objective of what you're trying to achieve.
Anything to add to that, Mark?
No, I very much go along with it. It's really interesting how you can get the double talk of an organisation that's values try and be positive about people and actually does a lot of damage along the way.
I don't know whether this is true, but I've read studies that say that it's like they compare different societies, and like the Netherlands is supposed to be one of the more secular societies in the so-called Western world. And by some measures, the United States is probably more religious at this point than the UK is. So I know this is a kind of broad question, but what is your sense as to how religion plays out in the public sphere in the UK?
Gosh, it's become a very contested space. In some ways, it's almost unacceptable. So for a frontline politician to name themselves as a person of faith has become quite a controversial place. And the difficulty of that is that it means you end up seeing, in a sense, quite rigid parodies of faith rather than the people where it's running at considerable depth. So, for example, just thinking of my own political party, one of our elder statesmen is Shirley Williams, who is a devout Catholic, and there is a quality of depth to her, but I've never heard her actually make a fuss about it. Whereas our last party leader got himself in hot water by failing to answer a question about whether he considered gay sex to be sinful in a terribly coherent way in an interview. And in a sense, the shallowness and the abrasiveness of the answer turned it into a fuss about him presenting as a persecuted Christian. And the sense was actually that what was kind of screaming was the shallowness of that. So it's become a space where actually, in a sense, the people of depth tend not to wear it on their sleeves. And I think one of the flip sides of that is you then get people slightly scared of it. So slightly scared, for example, of religious fundamentalism because it's the only form of religion that's visible, which kind of makes the public discourse quite difficult to hold on this one.
Yeah, that's interesting. The whole fundamentalism thing sort of colors the whole religious space in a certain sense. Yeah. Anything you want to add on that, Coreene, in terms of?
I think also because there are so many negatives associated with people who have a belief in something and in religion, that as being the benchmarks for no, you know, you don't do this and you don't do that and you don't behave in this way. And I think that the rigidness, or what is perceived as being rigid, is what repels people. It doesn't feel as though you can live up to that. And I think that's part of what, as the world becomes more inclusive, to be someone who belongs to a belief system that says no to things is really challenging for a lot of people. Everybody just wants, you know, it's everybody wants there to be a common denominator of just acceptability. There is no truth, but universal truths, and I think that's a challenge.
Say no to something. What like for example? What do you mean?
So as Markham sort of alluded to about it's improved, but generally in a lot of Christian denominations, they would say that homosexuality is not acceptable, that type of thing. I mean, I think things have moved on, but the association is still very powerfully alive with that kind of way of being.
And yet we also have respect for people like Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela, where there's actually a profound depth in the spirituality going on, and actually the sense that these are people of enormous wisdom, where the spirituality is part of who they are, which has enabled a very rich contribution.
So it's kind of a schizophrenic thing. On one hand, we revere your Mandelas and your Martin Luther Kings, etc. But if you are to proclaim that you're part of that particular faith tradition, that's not considered sort of kosher or something. Use an unfortunate word.
or it may be that these are people who've been placed in extraordinarily difficult situations and found the resources to cope with that. And maybe one of the things religion does is enable that process to happen. But it kind of becomes obvious when you're caught in those very difficult places, which in a sense none of us actually want to find ourselves in.
You know, I mean, I guess the question was about religion in the UK and what that means in the public space, but the larger question is about the society is increasingly a secular society. That just seems to be where it's going. I doubt whether it's going to go, well, I don't know, it depends on where we're talking about, for example. But whenever I've seen studies at least in the so-called developed world, and also in the developing world, there's this sense, either there's this kind of bubbling up of so-called new religious movements, which is all over the world, or the sort of established religions are no longer as popular. So I'm making it more complicated than it needs to be. But in any event, in the societies that we're most familiar with, it's increasingly a secular space. So that brings up a lot of challenges for people of faith, and probably for the society in and of itself. So I mean, I've just made a speech, but I'd like to hear your thoughts about it.
Well, my thought is that I think that people are looking for faith in new forms, and it's faith is replaced by other ways of engaging, that it's replaced by other religions. So, you know, there's the rise of Buddhism. There's a profound commitment and belief in things like mindfulness.
Yes.
And I think that people are looking for God in other spaces, and they think that actually that, you know, their belief in themselves is probably enough. You know, that's enough to get through. If I can keep it together, I don't need anything or anyone beyond me. So I think that's a big shift.
Mm-hmm. You know, you've in this workshop, which either you did or you wanted to do, you talked about the Equality Act in the UK that makes religion a protected class under discrimination law. So what's the impact of that law, and how does that affect people at work? How does it affect people of faith at work? She's just part of the podcast. That's I'm not worried about it.
Wants to be part of it. That always happens. I can guarantee it. Sorry.
In some ways, I suppose it's really positive because it makes it.
You probably should say what the Equality Act is. Most of the people listen to this are from the U.S.
I mean, the Equalities Act brought together a lot of pre-existing legislation into a single Equality Act of Parliament overseen by a single equalities body, which its aim is to stop discrimination. So it's
basically a discrimination law against people of faith.
Well, it's not just people of faith. It allows you to bring action for discrimination on grounds of, I'm going to forget the full list, but race, gender, sexual orientation, marital status, age, So religion is part of that process. I mean, in some ways, it's been very, very positive, because it does mean that you have a way of dealing with things that previously you would have been quite difficult to take legal action over. And that's really useful for kind of promoting equalities and things. The sort of flip side is it can make some things sort of harder to talk about. The thought, for example, with religion is that if you're in a secular workspace, it probably pushes into the category of not to be talked about in case you upset people. And the thought is that actually it might be quite a basic part of being human. And so if you're not able to talk about it, kind of where does that energy go? And possibly you end up with the strident voices being the ones who are going to talk about it anyway out of a sense of kind of proselytizing or very assertiveness, which is what the Equalities Act's trying to mitigate against. And that means the much more sensitive stuff kind of disappears. And I'm thinking there, I mean, somebody like Nelson Mandela is an interesting example of somebody finding resources in their faith tradition to do something remarkable. Then you then create a world where you can say what they did was amazing, but it becomes much harder to talk about the spiritual resources they might have been drawing on. Or if you do that, it puts it into a very tightly defined box, where in a sense, at its healthiest, it's kind of thoroughly integrated into the humanity of the person.
So let me just push back a little bit. Why is it important to be able to talk about these kind of things? You know, in other words, like to some extent, a lot of it's channeled into sort of spiritual, not spiritual, what's the word, secular type things. So I may have a particular faith about something in a particular way that's informed by my faith. So nowadays, that's kind of like a lot of that stuff is kind of put in human resource language, let's say. So I'm just trying to understand what you mean exactly by things that people can't talk about. What do you mean by that?
If I give a slightly different example that just might make sense of it, if you think of a workplace situation where everybody's talking about relationships with partners of the opposite sex, so you've got an entirely heteronormative setup, what does that do to the person who's gay or single in terms of feeling that they can't talk about things that are important to them? It's absolutely fine if they get the message and it is okay to talk about that, but there's the awkward space where that message hasn't got across. I think for the religion one, the difficulty is that from the beginning you're dealing with fairly sensitive stuff. And the question is, if I name what's going on for me, is that acceptable? Or is it going to cause real discomfort? And I suppose the sort of example I'm thinking of here is the way people kind of almost unwittingly define themselves by their religion. And if you then can't name it, you've got something going on that's quite important about your definition. And I'm thinking here in UK terms, deep divisions between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland and in bits of Scotland. So if the law says you can't name the religious bit of that, you've still got the divisions floating around, but you've then lost the way to talk about it, which might be wonderful for helping people to come together, but might also mean you've got a division that's going on that's just getting expressed in other terms.
So, Coreene, to me, this is sort of like falls into the kind of rubric of being able to bring your whole self to work, kind of thing. So, you know, so I'm wondering what your thoughts on that are. It's
interesting because that's exactly the thought that I was having, that it is aligned to that idea of bringing your whole self to work. And I was thinking, well, most of the people of faith that I know, faith is not an add-on, it's central to who they are. So to suppress something that's quite essential is quite challenging, and it means that they can't really be who they are, or just to be able to say something really ordinary. I went to a church event, or we went to church on Sunday. People don't really say things like that anymore. It would be seen as being quite strange to say something like that, and even though lots of people do. And I think that it's with any kind of exclusion, I think it just means that people are less free, less able to be who they're meant to be, and you know, then what else is excluded from the conversation that doesn't seem quite fitting anymore. And you know, it's one thing if your faith is something that is, you know, that can be is not so overt. So like Christianity, you don't necessarily need to name yourself as being a Christian, but if you are someone who's Muslim, or if you're Jewish, and that, you know, there are other faiths that actually their markers are quite visible, and it means that those people are really challenged to suppress something that's quite important, or to have to sort of walk in it all the time, you know, like to wear it, kind of carry it all the time, which I think can be quite a burden.
Yeah, you know, it seems like particularly an issue among people that are not in the mainstream in terms of their faith traditions. The mainstream in the case of the UK, United States, it could be you're a Muslim, you're a member of one of these new religious movements, or even if you're Jewish, basically, it becomes more of an issue.
Yeah, I think if you turn up and you're some sort of new age spiritualist, that's somehow much more acceptable than being in, you know, something that's more established because of the associations with some of the mainstream you know, established religions.
So I guess the larger question, to use your sort of expertise, since both of you are both people of faith and also people that are involved in you know, group relations, in the sense that we're becoming a more secular society, what does this mean in terms of the unconscious? What is going on that is not perhaps as healthy for society in terms of the gradual secularization of life? You're looking at me, or are you looking for?
I'm thinking, does he want to say something?
Well, I suppose my first thought on that is a very Jungian one. I mean, Jung came up with this, I think, really useful idea that progress in the West has come at the expense of our ability to feel. So a lot of the unconscious stuff gets pushed away in order to achieve the sort of successes which have delivered massive technological advances. But we've paid a fairly heavy price for that. And I think that's getting pushed further away as we develop. And if you compare that with bits of the world which, if you like, the language of development will be described as less developed, you see something there actually very rich going on that we sort of lost sight of. So I think there's something quite important in terms of what we're losing, I feel like a price we're paying for our technological progress, in terms of actually dehumanizing us. So I suppose there's the spirituality question is, can the religion be not something which is just about saying no all the time, but actually about recovering our full humanity in all its depth?
It sounds like a critique of capitalism, actually.
Yes. Fair enough.
So I know the two of you are involved in this sort of dialogue as to the role of you know, faith in society and this, that, and the other thing. I guess that sort of a final question I have for both of you is: what would you like people to understand that they're not really understanding about this particular subject? Why is this important?
I think for me, faith for me and for lots of people is a core value, and to be able to be in touch with all aspects of yourself and use them to influence or shape how you are in the world and what you do in the world is really important. To have you know, a work face and a private face, I think is a bit of a shame, and that it damages all of us if we're hidden and can't speak to who and what we are, or at least if we want to. It's not that you have to, but if you want to. And I think that you know, there's certain ways of being in the world that are acceptable and some ways aren't. And I do think that a little bit that it's the thin end of the wedge, and denies that well, maybe not everyone believes that, but you know, there is. I think that that we're more than what we see. That there's something else in the world, you know, more than us. So I think for me that is really, really important, to be able to engage with just at least to think about it, to have an open conversation about it is valuable, whether you agree or disagree, but the way that you would about anything else.
I suppose what I add to that is there's something about where you're rooted at a very deep level, and some of that you have to find out about by accident, because it's so instinctual that you find out about it by meeting people who are in a different place. But there's also something about the depth of the human connection with others where you can engage at that level and let yourself be rooted and enable the rootedness of somebody else. And is incredibly important for sort of balanced functioning at depth, rather than just sort of that day-to-day survival.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't even talked about the interreligious conflict, which is also a part of this. So, I mean, it's one thing we're talking about the role of religion in society, but then, as you know, increasingly there are many religions, and there's a whole thing that's going on with that. And I don't know if any of you want to speak to that, but it's a big thing here. I know.
I think there are many religions in the UK as well, and some are more spoken about than others. I think the conflict still seems to be in existence amongst the established ones. You hear less about things that are happening amongst between the smaller religions. But I don't know, would you say that's true, Mark? Would you agree with that?
I mean, broadly, I suppose there's something about the perception and then the reality of how people live out their faith and engage. And of course, the difficulty is that very often people are having deep connections within their own faith tradition, and it's quite a complicated task to then try and relate across faith traditions. And I find it useful to do that in terms of what can I learn from another tradition, so you're in learning mode rather than anything else. But I suppose it's part of an increasing fragmentation in society, and that's not always as healthy as it might be.
Wow. Well, I mean, we've basically just scratched the surface in a very a very complex and actually sensitive topic. And I'd like to just thank you for being my guest. I just want to basically tell people, if they want to know more about the Diversity and Spirituality Network, they can go to our website. Every third Saturday, we have an online event that you can find out by going to our webpage and looking under events. And finally, if you like the podcast a lot and want to support it, you can support it by going to patreon.com and in effect become a sponsor of the show. And I'm wondering if there's any, if somebody wanted to engage with you all around these topics, how would they go about doing so?
Well, one thing is that Coreene and I are both doing an event together in April, on the 8th of April in London, under the auspices of an organisation called Opus. That's opus.org.uk, which is looking specifically at this whole issue.
Yeah, if you would send me a link to that, Mark, I can post it in the show notes, and maybe I'll even, if I get technological, I can make it kind of a subhead. I'm not promising that though.
Thank you.
But in any event, thank you very much for participating, and thank your daughter also for humanizing our talk here.
You're welcome. Thank you very much as well for your time this evening.
All right, thank you very much. All right, bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.